Hi again everybody. Here's the first video in my latest gaming system build. This particular build is going to be using AMD processor and an AMD graphics processing unit or video card. You see the parts in front of me right now that I'm going to be using. Start off with the motherboard. I will be using the Tomahawk B450 from MSI. One thing to note, and I do have to apologize for this, I made the video where I was doing the shopping at Micro Center on Black Friday, and I bought a different board. I had to return that board, actually exchange it for this one, because one of my dedicated followers, Catherine Anna Hauserman, pointed out to me that that board really had an inadequate VRM for that particular processor I have here, the AMD 2700X Ryzen 7. So I did a follow-up research on it along with research that she provided me. I decided I had to change that board. This is the board. It wound up costing me an extra $48 with tax. But this one also has a $10 rebate on it. So it's not a total loss. I think $38 is doable. Anyway, the other parts include, as I mentioned, the AMD Ryzen 7. This particular one is a 2700X, the top end of the 200 series of the Ryzen processors. I also have here memory. That'll be Corsairs. And this is memory I just had on the shelf that I took out of another system at one point. Originally, this was in my main computer system, but I upgraded that to 3200, and I also doubled it to 32 gig. So this is what I have left right now, and it's good enough to get started with this. We'll see how it goes. But this is 16 gigabytes of 3000 megahertz Corsair memory. And I have this 480 gig SSD. This will be the main boot drive. I took this out, as you may have recalled if you've seen my latest server build updates. This was the one that I had in that server, and I replaced it with a smaller one, actually, a 240 gig, which is all you need for using it as a server. Also, the power supply that I picked is the Corsair CX650. It is a non-modular power supply, but the price was right, so I had to go with it. And then finally, the graphics processing unit, or video card. It is a Radeon RX 580 with 8 gigabytes of memory. It's a pretty good card. Now you may notice that there are two cases over here. Now this case you have already seen. It is the case that I recently did a review on, and I put in an old computer, a Pentium processor in it. So I only had limited capability of testing the heat capability of this box. Well, I'm going to build it in this case to start with. However, there is a second case here from DIY, and I'm going to actually move it after I build it in this case. I'm going to move it over to this case for purposes of comparing to see which one is better in terms of dealing with the heat. Now this is a bit more expensive case than this one. However, this one has some advantages too. I think it actually has the capability of being a bit cooler, but we will find out. And then whichever one of these cases it winds up running cooler in is the case that I will leave it in. Let me move on to the assembly of the component. Okay, what I have here is an anti-static mat, and I also have an anti-static wrist strap. So I'm going to do belt and suspenders today. I play with processors, motherboards that may be sensitive to that. Take the motherboard, let's take it out of its package. A lot of extra stuff in here right now that I don't have to pay attention to. So I'll put this on the side. Let's get this out of its bag. Best to grab it by the VRM heatsink. And what I will do is I will put it on top of the actual motherboard case. It's a nice solid surface. It is anti-static. Okay, the first thing we're going to have to do is open up the CPU chip. So I push this aside, and let's get the CPU chip out of its box. See, I did not open this at all yet. This is the cooler that comes with that particular chip. It's one of the higher end AMD for Ryzen coolers. It has RGB in it. A really good cooler. There's no reason for me to upgrade this right now unless I see heat problems. It should be good to get started with. That goes on in a few minutes. Let me get the chip out. The chip is in this little box here. This is where the money's spent. So I got the actual Ryzen CPU chip here. And I got a nice case sticker too if I want to show off what I have in it. Get this out. Very carefully. Nice anti-static plastic holder for it. Make sure it pops open, and it does. Let me get the motherboard back in here. Now what you need to do is pull up on the motherboard. You have to pull up this little lever. It's sort of underneath this plastic holder right here. So you got to be very careful that you get underneath this as you pull this up, pull the whole thing up. That opens up the socket. Now for modern AMD processors, except for their Threadripper line, they do it like the actual old Intel used to do it. They actually put the pins on the CPU chip. The socket has the female end of it. So the male on the chip, the female in the socket. I think just about all of the Intel ones are reversed from that. We have to get this oriented right. If you look very carefully, there's a little triangle here, right where I have this finger. That triangle has to line up with the triangle that is actually on the socket. So if you look very carefully here, as I said, on the CPU, it's easy to see this little gold triangle right here. The socket, though, has an actual dot off to one side. So if you look right here where that corner is, there's a white dot on the motherboard. That has to line up with that. So we take this and we very carefully put it down into the chip socket and try to align the holes. It should fall in smoothly. Like to wiggle a little bit. Make sure that it's correct. And if you look again carefully, I have now the triangle and the dot lined up together. It's actually in the manual. If you're interested, they actually show you a picture here that shows they're basically in that same orientation. Once we got it like this, then we can go ahead, push this down, and then back under. And the CPU chip is in. Once the CPU chip is in, there's a lot of risk that has been put aside at this point. So we're looking good. That's the most risky part of where you could damage the CPU or the motherboard. But usually when a chip is into a PCB board, which is what this is, a printed circuit board, it takes care of all of its grounding of any static electricity that might occur. Not 100%, but a lot of it. Now what I have here is some 99% isopropyl alcohol. And I'm going to give the CPU chip a nice cleaning before we go ahead and mount the cooler to it. We use 99%, which is as close to 100 as you're going to be able to find anywhere, so that it doesn't leave any water behind. If I take some paper towels, and I put it on the paper towels, close the alcohol up right away so it doesn't lose its potency, I can go ahead and clean the top of the chip. I am also going to do the same thing to the bottom of the cooler. Give it a nice polishing. Then I take the cooler. Well, this one I'm not going to clean because it's already got on it the thermal paste. And I want to use that thermal paste, so I don't want to destroy it right now. Some people don't do that, but I'll give the thermal paste that came with the CPU and cooler the first shot. If I ever have to change it, it'll get a different thermal paste than that. So at this point, we're ready to go. I can go ahead and mount the actual cooler onto the CPU. So if you'll notice, there's these little hooks on the side. I've got to catch them onto the hooks on this. So I have to carefully place this on top of the CPU, and I have to get these hooks to fall into place on the side and catch them onto the sides. I'll show you what I mean with this one. So if you look very carefully at this one, you'll see I have to try to catch it onto the side there. This side is stable, so I have to get it in first. And then the other side has a latch on it, so I do that one second. Come down, get that one in, and then on the other side, I have an actual latch that I have to deal with. So I open the latch up, get this little clip onto there, onto that little plastic clip there. Down in the bottom, the other thing is on the little plastic clip. Now I'll double check to make sure it's lined up. It's locked on that clip, it's locked on that clip, and now I take this little latch here and I actually push it and lock it in place. I have to go all the way to the other side in order to lock it. Like that. So now it's locked. Now we have the CPU and we have the cooler on it. Before we forget, there is the cable for the fan. So we have to make sure that the fan is plugged into the proper connector on the motherboard. So if I look in the manual, just to double check, the CPU fan is this connector that's between the socket for the CPU and the memory chips. It has a little key to it. Make sure the key falls into the little latch on this side. Push it like that. It should not give you any resistance. We now have that set. We have the motherboard. Now what I'll do later is I will use some tie wrap, tie this up so that they stay out of the way. Now I have to do the memory. Now this is where you have to actually check the manual to make sure you know which memory sockets to use. The Corsair Vengeance. You're putting 4 in, it's pretty straightforward. Each one has to be filled. However, when you're only putting 1 or 2, the manual tells you exactly which sockets to use that are ideal for proper memory throughput and heating dissipation, so it's both. But you do have to have them, I'll tell you right off the bat, no matter which pair they use, they are the ones that are separated by a blank spot. That's always the case. This is called dual channel memory. 2 of them are 1 channel, the other 2 are the 2nd channel. You got to put 1 memory chip in each channel. And here in the manual they show you where they want you to put it. So if there was just 1, it goes in that 1 socket there. If it's 2, it goes into these, separated from, and this is the end of the board. And then if it's 4, you just fill them all in. So I'm going to want to put those 2 in sockets B2 and A2. According to this, B2 is this one on the end, and A2 is 1 over from that. You got to make sure that they're open. So these clips have to be opened up. They were closed. So you got to make sure that they're properly opened. Like that. Those are the 2 that I'm going to put them into. Now if you notice on the memory, there's not an equal spacing between the lands of the memory chips and this notch. The same thing is on the socket. There is not equal spacing. So you have to line that up. The more spacing is actually this way. So they're going to have to go in this way. So what you do is you push it straight down in. This one is stationary. Oh, it's not, I'm sorry. On this motherboard, it's not. So we open up both ends. On most motherboards, one end is locked in place. This one is not the case. And then you push straight down in, make sure that the notch lines up, and just push it right in. You hear 2 clicks, 1 on each side. And then I do the same thing with the other one. Make sure it's the right way with the notch in the right place. Put it into the holders at the ends, and then I go straight down. 2 clicks, it's locked. So now we have the motherboard, CPU, cooler, and its memory all ready to go. At this point, we can go into the case. I just remembered something before we put it in the case. I'm going to put the cable for the RGB on the cooler. So the cooler came with 2 cables. One is a regular RGB cable, and the other one is a USB cable. So this can be connected either through USB, which you can have software then running to control its RGB, or you can do it so that it connects through the regular RGB cable. And on the side here, there are actual little rubber plastic things that are blocking the ports, and one is set for the USB and one is the RGB right over here. So the one I want to use is a little 4-pin RGB. So I'm going to plug that one into the 4-pin RGB. It should only go one way. Let me just double check that as I do it. I got to plug this in here. There we go. So now that connector is connected to the cooler so that we can have RGB using a standard RGB cable. I'm going to put the little plastic rubber, it's a little rubber protector. I'm going to put the rubber protector back into the USB one. There we go. That's in. Now this is what the RGB is going to be connected to. The standard 4-pin 12-volt RGB. But if you use the USB one, then it's only going to give a 5-volt supply to it as well, in addition to being controlled by the PC through a USB. Okay, let's get the case ready. Okay, I now have the case laid out here, ready to have the motherboard installed in it. 2 things I have to do before I put the motherboard in. One is I have to make sure that all of these studs, which are already mounted in the case, they were that way when it came, I didn't change anything during my initial test, that they're all in the right place to match the motherboard that I have. And as I look at it, I see there's 3 at the bottom, there's 3 in the middle. I'm looking at the motherboard off to the side here, and there's 3 at the top. So we're looking good. So what I will do at this point is now install the I/O shield. The I/O shield in this little plastic. This is a budget motherboard, really, so it doesn't have this built onto the motherboard like some of the newer motherboards, the X570s and such. However, they did a nice job setting out the I/O on this so that it has a nice silk screen on top of black. That'll match the case much more appropriately. So I have to get this in to the case first before I put the motherboard in. I have to match what's on the case. Now, it always happens that the connectors for the audio are always to the bottom of the case. The bottom is that way. So it has to definitely go in this orientation. And I have to get it up into this little hole. This is always a challenge. And of course I got the fan wire in the way. And you have to sort of do it corner by corner until you get it in place. It sometimes takes a few attempts to push it. As you push one corner in, it probably jumps out of the other corner. Actually, that was pretty straightforward. That one actually worked very well. I was surprised by how well that worked. So if you look here, I now have the I/O shield installed. But let me turn it around the other way again so you can see the installation of the motherboard a little bit better. So I got to get all these cables out of the way. I'm going to push them to the back right now so that they're out of the way. I don't want them getting crimped underneath anything. They'll all be dressed later, but for now we don't. Now I'm going to take the motherboard. At this point, the best way to hold the motherboard is by the cooler. And you've got to really get it in the way so it sort of dips in towards the I/O shield. Because in this case, it's even under a fan. So you got to go down like that with that end further down than this end in order to sort of dip it in place until you get all of the connectors properly lined up. And you got to be very careful that you don't have any of the fingers from the I/O shield bent the wrong way. And it actually looks pretty good. I'll show you this. As you can see, it looks pretty good. There's none of these little fingers from the I/O shield that are bent the wrong, little fingers underneath the I/O shield that can bend. And all of the connectors seem to be lined up with the silkscreen on the outside. So I think we're pretty good at this point. Due to the length of this video and the time it has taken to complete the editing, I am forced to break it into two parts. The second part will be uploaded to YouTube in a couple of days. I sincerely apologize.